Hello and welcome to this BRIC Community Town Hall. Tonight we're going to be discussing a very important topic. It's big money and politics. Can your voice count? It's a small question that's a really, really big deal, as evident by the people who've assembled on the stage this evening at our invitation and our town, which we're so happy to see that you've come here tonight to discuss this with us. We've had a series of town halls here at BRIC. The first was about policing communities of color in the wake of lots of incidents that had happened and the social mobilization that took place in Brooklyn and around the country. And the second of the series was about gentrification and its impact on the place where we live. So the through line there was very clear, and we've arrived here tonight talking at big money and politics. Now that line might be a little harder to thread for some of you, me probably being the number one, because when it was brought up, I said, no one's coming to that. But you all proved me wrong, and you're here, and you're watching or listening on our partner in this broadcast, WBAI Radio. We thank them for simulcasting this. So if you're just tuning in, whether you're on the telly or you're listening on the radio or looking online, call up a friend and tell them that you have the opportunity to be enlightened. Because I'm a recent convert, and like the recently converted, I'm really into this subject right now because I found a way in last night, in no small part thanks to the people sitting on the stage now. So I'm going to introduce them to you. First, across from me is New York City's public advocate and former city council member, Ms. Letitia James. Next to public advocate James is Doug Henwood. He is a journalist. Hey, clap already. We like Doug. You read his stuff, now you get to see the face that goes with it. Doug Henwood is a journalist, an economic journalist, who writes about the intersection of politics and money and all that fun stuff. Real life, stranger than fiction. And next to Doug, of course, we have the man who's Dick Dadey. He's the executive director of Citizens Union, New York's oldest good government watchdog. Thank you for the work, and thank you for being here, Dick. And the next man is here bringing a little comic relief and some serious commentary as well. He's Ted Alexandro, a political activist as well as an entertainer and comedian. Thanks for being here, Ted.
My pleasure, thank you.
And of course, you recognize this man here from his long record of public service at the state and city levels, Mr. Al Van, who proudly represented, before he left the city council, proudly represented Brooklyn in the 36th district. My home. Thank you, Mr. Van, for being here. And the person to my immediate left is a professor at Fordham University, and she's also a 2014 gubernatorial candidate, and she's also the author of this book in my hands, Corruption in America. She is Zephyr Teachout. So I made a confession just a while ago that I was not very into this topic. It's like, guys, how do we go from racing and police at this Ferguson, Eric Garner moment? How do we go from gentrification when my rent just went up to big money in politics? That's not the sexiest water cooler thing. But you guys are all smarter than me, so I'm going to start with you, public advocate, and ask, how does big money and politics infiltrate us where we live every day in ways, big or small, we might not even realize?
So first, let me thank BRIC and WBAI for sponsoring this, and to all of my friends out there in the audience. And just to, Brian, to make it relevant and to spark your interest, I would not be here but for campaign financing. I would not be the public advocate of the city of New York. Campaign finance creates a level playing field. And the reality is that our system of government is broken. And it's broken because of the influence of big money. You see, when I ran for office, a lot of the individuals in the audience supported me. But they're not millionaires and billionaires. Well, I don't think so. And so they gave $5 and they gave $10. But I was outspent almost 6 to 1. And so if you want the voice of everyday New Yorkers, individuals who care about the crisis in affordable housing, gentrification, community policing, if you want more women and more people of color and more everyday individuals, individuals who just really fundamentally believe that government can be used for good, then we've got to remove the big money and the influence that big money has, because right now they have hijacked our government.
Tell us about how big money influences our everyday lives.
It influences everything. Actually, when you were talking, I was thinking about what Stephen Colbert said about net neutrality, which is if you want to do something really evil, make it boring. Make it be the kind of thing people don't want to talk about. But the truth is, we can't talk about gentrification without talking about money and politics, because look at the power of a handful of real estate interests that have hijacked our city.
Right.
You can't talk about the future of our energy policy without talking about money and politics, because there is so much invested in gas, coal, trying to keep us back from a solar energy, renewable energy future. You can't talk about education policy without talking about money and politics, because this past year, basically 4 hedge fund managers spent millions and millions of their own dollars to try to control education policy in New York State. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, they succeeded. Not just how much money we're getting, but the way in which that money is spent, the way in which teachers are evaluated. That's being driven by a handful of big donors. So the public advocate is exactly right. We have a broken system. We cannot have a private financing system and actually have self-governance. We have to move away from private financing altogether. So if you think it's not affecting you, it's affecting you so much you can't even see it.
You hold up this mirror to ourselves and make us laugh at these things, but what is something that is insidious in all of the money and politics right now?
Well, I think, like has been articulated and was part of the Occupy movement, the sense that all our grievances are connected. And because the money is so entrenched and really does influence everything, you can point to any of the movements that are going on, not only domestically, but internationally. Certainly the Black Lives Matter movement. When you talk about money in politics, you're talking about money that goes towards racist policing policies that target poor communities of color, that, I think in Ferguson, they had more citations written than actually people were living there, the population. So that's money. That's money in politics. That's policies that are targeting folks in a specific community in the interest of making money. And all of that goes under the umbrella of austerity or neoliberalism. And again, to take it internationally, we're seeing that whether it's in Greece, fortunately we're seeing pushback with the election of Syriza, in Spain, Podemos, in Ireland with the water taxes, people are fighting back there. So I don't see this as just a domestic issue. I think because we're talking about a global economy and globalization, we have to think as a movement globally, because they're attacking across the globe.
So Doug, you do this every day for a living. You have to find some way to make people see that it affects them where they live.
Well, where they live, literally. I mean, I didn't realize you had an earlier session on gentrification, so I'm going to touch on that a little bit. But we're sitting in the midst of what is really the engineered upscaling of a good bit of Brooklyn. And people often look at the streetscape or the landscape around them and think this is just spontaneous market forces. But if you take a close look at what's been happening in and around this neighborhood over the last couple of decades, really, what you see is a very deliberate plan to it started in the Koch years in the 80s, to extend the central business district out of Manhattan into downtown Brooklyn, also into Long Island City. That's proceeding less successfully. But the downtown Brooklyn part is succeeding quite well. And the idea was to redevelop the commercial areas there, to put in high-rises, residential high-rises, offices, redo the Fulton Mall. You can see this in the 1987 plan that the Koch people published called New York Ascendant. And then it continued into the 90s and beyond with the Bloomberg administration, and now it continues today. So you see the development of City Point just off the Fulton Mall. And all these things are not accidents. They are planned by a combination of real estate interests operating through things like the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, but also with the city government through the Economic Development Corporation, which is a very murky entity that people don't really know much about. Now, the head of de Blasio's city planning department is Carl Weisbrod, who ran the Economic Development Corporation at one point, and earlier ran the Trinity Church real estate portfolio and also the upscaling of Times Square. So he is like a walking embodiment of the way that government, real estate, and financial interest all work together to produce this gentrification. It's not just happening by accident. And I'm sorry to say that the arts are also an important part of this scheme. We're sitting in what the planners are now calling the Brooklyn Cultural District. BAM is at the center of it, but also BRIC is also part of it. There are several other major institutions around here, the Mark Morris Company. And the idea is, to create, I love the arts, I love BRIC, I love BAM, but the way that real estate people see it as a way of lubricating this process of upscaling. Now, since this stuff is not spontaneous, since it's planned, but done very murkily with very little public input, I think we need to think about how ordinary citizens can get a hold of this process. So much goes on behind closed doors. The Economic Development Corporation will hold hearings, but after decisions have been made, and it's just all pro forma and ritualistic. So you need some kind of way to counter that organized power for an energized public.
Thank you, Doug.
Which I don't see yet, but we need that.
Well, I'd like to think we're at the center of that cultural arts district, but that being said, we're going to move on and ask you, Dick, about this influence of money in our everyday lives.
Sure. I mean, what's been interesting to see happen over the last couple of decades with the rise of special interests and big moneyed interests trying to influence government decisions, we've seen a precipitous drop in the number of voters turning out and participating. I don't think necessarily there's a cause and effect, but that's something that needs to be examined, and that we are not, taking control of the opportunities that we have as New Yorkers to vote. New York State, in its most recent election, was the 45th or 46th state in voter turnout. We're at the bottom of the barrel in the country in terms of the number of voters, eligible voters coming out and voting. And why is that? I think people may feel a sense of powerlessness, a sense that they're not able to influence the decisions, but by not voting, we're giving up. And what we need to do is take a look at ways in which we can engage people more in our democracy. In terms of how real this influence is taking place in New York, we just passed a state budget, $150 billion state budget. And in the governor's proposed budget, there was no mention of a tax credit for buyers of luxury yachts. But there was a proposal for raising the minimum wage, which now is, I think, is $8.75, is going to go up to $9 next year. And out of nowhere, in the last couple of days, up pops this tax credit for luxury yacht owners. And the minimum wage dropped off the table. Right. And there may be an argument, there may be an economic argument that we need to make sure that yachts are built here in New York State. But for there not to have been any attention given to the real issue of needing to raise the minimum wage. I mean, Governor Cuomo proposed $10.50. There are other proposals out there to raise it to a living wage of $15. I mean, it's just outrageous that, one side of the equation is being addressed, money and interest like that, and people who are struggling in this city who need an increase in the minimum wage have been ignored so far.
Yeah. So you're the senior statesman, Mr. Van. How does big money affect your constituents in Bed-Stuy?
Well, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Fred Douglass. But that's not the quote that's applicable tonight. There was another gentleman who lived in the 19th century, referred to as Lord Acton, I believe, and he made some rather profound statements during his time. In fact, he could have lived in the 21st century because you know his quote. He said, power corrupts. No, he said power tends to corrupt. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. I'm glad he put that tens in there because there is a little hope there that there can be a difference, there can be a change. I want to go back. Sometimes you have to go back to go ahead. Elected officials are a very unique status in our society because they're the only ones that get their job by getting elected. You can be a doctor, you can be an engineer, physicist, city worker, whatever. You don't get elected to those jobs. So there should be a bond or a trust because you are representing people. And they have a power. What's that power? The power of elected officials is that they can affect everybody else in society. No other job, no other profession can do that. Through taxation, right? Through regulations, right? Or through the budget priorities in terms of how they're going to spend the taxpayers' money. And because they have this unique power, guess what? They are sought after. They're pursued. Because if you have an interest and you want to enhance your interests, and it can be done by affecting those who make those decisions, then you'll find a way to get to them. So, you know, elected officials, those who are alleged to have been corrupt, those who have been found to be corrupt, they don't have a special corrupt gene. You know, it's not in their DNA necessarily. It could be any of us sitting in this town hall meeting, right? But because of the position that they hold and the power that they have, they are going to be tempted. They're going to be tempted. And we live in America, capital America. What's the most motivating force in America? Money, right? And so money and those who have it will use that money to influence whatever legislative body, whatever, to try and satisfy their needs and satisfy their means. So there has to be two to tango. You got money you want to influence, somebody has to accept that money. Yeah. Right? And so I like to get to the next step, but I'm going to stop, and I know you want to go around. I want to whet your appetite and say, well, where is he coming from and what's next?
So speaking about the money that comes into politics, we have a very interesting graph about money that was spent on the elections of 2012 that we're going to be putting up in a second. But the chart will show, and it's coming up now, that there was about 1.8, that 1,800 that you see, this is federal lobbying expenditures and campaign contributions by the financial sector. And this is what Elizabeth Warren has been talking about. This is down in Wall Street. 2014, lobbyists and campaign contributors, that's about 1.4 billion with the B dollars that we see there. So I'm taking it back just a little from 2014 to 2012, the last time we had a presidential election. $2 billion spent by the Romney and Obama campaigns by the time it was all told. What does $2 billion get you?
Well, right now, I mean, it's a great chart. It's a terrible chart, but it's a great chart because it's not just that it's the financial sector. This financial sector is unbelievably concentrated. This is not tens of thousands of community banks who are all coming together who want to make sure they serve the lending needs of their community. This is a handful of powerful, primarily men, who are using their power, their corporate power and their money power to control policy.
Right.
And they're doing it through lobbying, which then, you know, you basically put it into, you pay lobbyists to almost act as middlemen, sometimes almost as bagmen. They go and they say, here's the policy interests we have. And then the candidate says, here's the fundraising needs I have. They don't need to have an explicit quid pro quo to have an exchange. And I was very involved in the 2009-2010 Dodd-Frank, trying to push back on, actually have real reform after the financial crisis of 2008. And I will tell you, they were spending $365 for every dollar we were spending when we were the most organized, trying to speak for some of the people in this country. So I think we need to not only have public financing elections, but break up these banks. And I actually, you know, to money and power is that one of the ways, and this is a traditional American way to deal with the problem of money and power, is you change the campaign finance system, but you also take it out at its root and make sure that we have decentralized power instead of this concentrated power.
So looking at the money that's coming into this thing, $2 billion sounds like a lot of money because it is a lot of money. But to put it into a little bit more context, in the same year, 2012, Americans spent about $2.7 billion on Halloween candy. For one day.
Temptation.
But the nature of temptation. So looking at all of the money that goes in, some would argue there's not a problem. Money is speech, and if we take away that money, we take away people's right to support who they would like to support.
Well, I'm all politics are local. Let's go back a little bit. The first question you asked really had to do with what is the impact on the average day citizen? Well, over time, right, given this phenomenon we're discussing, money and power, over time, the constituency began to internalize that they are without power, right? They therefore believe government does nothing for them. It's of no value. And consequently, they do not participate in political activities and so forth, right? Beyond that, there becomes an over-reliance on individual elected officials that represent them with very little accountability. Because it's hard for them to figure out how to deal with all of this big issue, they focus on how can I deal with it in my community, and my elected official will protect, preserve, and so I don't have to do anything.
And
basically.
over-reliance on the government officials.
Well,
So just while we're here, there's one person who's currently elected in an office. So I want to ask you, if you are in office right now representing people, does that apathy make it easier to do your job, or does it make it tougher to do your job in a real world way?
So a couple of points. The chart that you showed, that represents not just the 1%, but 1% of the 1%ers.
Yeah.
The $2 billion who basically hijacked our government. Two, thank you. Two, currently right now, there is a rule in the SEC which obviously controls our retirement funds. And the GOP, the Republicans, the good old party, they're basically suing to overturn a rule which would protect pension dollars because they want money managers to invest in politics. My office has filed an amicus to protect pension dollars. But the point is that there are interests out there in the Republican Party. Their argument in their papers, they basically say, well, how are we going to raise money unless these, money managers invest in our campaigns? And that's why we should overturn this decision by SEC, because it represents a violation of the First Amendment. I disagree, and we filed an amicus. And I hope all of you join me in that litigation. Three, my first meeting this morning I was served on a panel focusing on homelessness. I can tell you there was 200 people at BRIC this morning. There were no lobbyists. They were the homeless. And then I left and went and spoke about childcare and what's happening to childcare centers, particularly the one in Brooklyn, not too far from here, which faces closure because of the threat of gentrification and market-driven factors. There were no lobbyists in that room. Oil is to Texas as real estate is to New York City. And so what we find on the steps of City Hall, on the steps of Washington, and even in Albany, are the influence of lobbyists over and over and over again in the face of elected officials trying to influence policy. Yeah. And so to answer your question, I'm not dismayed by apathy. I try to motivate and encourage individuals. And I must say, when I ran for office, I got the highest number of votes of anyone in the city of New York, despite the fact that every newspaper opposed me because they don't want a voice representing the interest of the homeless and children and working people in the city of New York. And what we need are more elected officials in the spirit of Al Van and others who can talk about issues that people care about, bread and butter issues. I want my child in child care. I want affordable housing. And I want a permanent home for individuals who are homeless as opposed to these quick fixes. And that's why we've got to inspire people and let them know that government can be an instrument and a tool for good as opposed to evil and corruption.
So, Dick, I want to go to you. The public advocate has this fire and this position and those votes, but she also has a $5 million budget that doesn't look very formidable next to billions of dollars. I'm sorry, I gave you an extra million. She's got a $4 million budget that pits up against interest that may not be in the
But like
best
a woman,
interest.
we're doing a lot with it.
So it's not a fair fight. How does your group help to even those scales?
Well, specifically the Public Advocate's Office, we have always argued that the Public Advocate's Office should have a larger budget. And thankfully, and to be given a little bit more authority, actually, too. Not only more money, but more authority. And, thankfully, under the current mayor, who was the previous public advocate, the current public advocate's budget has been raised, but we believe that it should be tied to a percentage of some other agency's budget so that it would grow naturally and it's not subject to the political whims or the desires of who's the mayor or who's the city council speaker. But I think what's important to emphasize what the public advocate is saying is that, our city is succeeding in a way that maybe New York is broken. In a way that Washington is broken. And with campaign finance, where we have public funding of elections. Just consider a couple facts. In New York State, where we do not have public funding of elections, and we need comprehensive campaign finance reform, competition for state legislative seats is very, very low. Yeah. Because of public campaign financing, 3 times as many incumbents in the city council were challenged than they are in the state legislature. There are far more candidates that run for the city council than do in the state legislature. And it shows not just that, public funding can counteract the influence of big money, but it can also inspire and motivate people to become involved. Our city council is a very representative body of the neighborhoods and communities that make up the city. It has evolved over the last 20 years ever since campaign finance was put into effect. And so we see, more neighborhood leaders and community activists joining. If you look at those that join the council, it's refreshing to see. The unfortunate thing is that there still is, moneyed interests that are operating now outside of the system. These independent expenditure campaigns.
City Council had the largest number of lobbyists in history donating money this year.
That's true. The one thing, however, is that their influence is less than it would be of the average citizen. Because if you're a city lobbyist, or if you are someone who does business with the city, you cannot have your contribution cannot be any more than $400 to a citywide candidate, and it's not matchable. And so it does even empower the smaller donors because their contributions are still matched.
Yeah, I'd like to speak. There is a limit to the power of the public advocate, but there's no limit to the power of the people.
That's right.
And so, even such a small percentage are participating, but those few who understand that advocacy and protest is a significant part of the political system, and that advocacy and protest can create an atmosphere for change, right? We've seen, I guess, the greatest example of our time is Dr. King, Reverend Dr. King, and the movement that we're celebrating now, 50 years anniversary. The movement was a movement of people in the street, and that led to the Voting Rights Act and a lot of other legislation that was to our people. So that there are levels where we can get things done for the right people in the right places, and they can get some things done. But until we are able to move the people en masse, we will always coming back for these town discussions, trying to figure out what can we do to make the change. Yeah. So when we get to the part of where we're dealing with reform, okay, then I have some other ideas I'd like to throw out.
Well, on our way to reform, maybe we should talk about revolt a little. Ted, you are in front of folks. You were down, along with the public advocate, down in Zuccotti with the people who are occupying Wall Street. Why haven't we seen a sustained, just movement of people who have had a I'm mad as hell moment? Where is that energy and action as we sit here in 2015 now?
Well, I would disagree. I think we do have a sustained movement and it's morphing and taking various forms. But the energy that coalesced at Zuccotti Park and then was violently crushed by the police department and the Department of Homeland Security. You know, this thing that where these people say to me, what happened to Occupy? Why did it fizzle out? It didn't fizzle. Things don't fizzle out in America. They're crushed by the powers that be because they see the potential for an uprising. So what I would say is that it hasn't fizzled, it hasn't gone away, it's taken other forms such as the Fight for 15, which is coming up on April 15th. All of the things that the public advocate was speaking about, people that don't have a voice, low wage workers, the LGBT community. And what's heartening to me is that a lot of these movements are being led by just those folks, by women. So yeah, I'm heartened by these movements that are going on throughout the country. That people may say, "What happened to Occupy?" But if you look around, Occupy may have sparked 1,000 other little things and made activism potent again.
Doug, you write about this stuff all of the time. How do you sort of hold up a mirror and let people know that they might feel just a little comfortable? They might not have slept outside during Occupy, but they're still among the 99.
Yeah, well, the Occupy moment was so exciting for me because I've been writing about this sort of thing for 25 years and nobody paid any attention. And then suddenly Occupy happened and then everybody paid attention. And it really, at least for a moment, really changed the political discourse in this country. And really, for a small group of people, it really had an enormous effect. But one of the problems, certainly it was crushed, but that's part of the problem. There's no way that the city government or the NYPD was going to let people stay in a park for very long. So I consider myself part of the Occupy movement. I don't think there's any formal requirements for membership. Need to think about long-term issues of organization and demands. And people were very shy about organization and demands around the Occupy movement. They thought it was corrupting. Power corrupts, I guess. But you can't contest for power without organization and demands. And I think certainly we have to credit the repression part of the end of Occupy, but also we have to think about how something like that can institutionalize itself for the longer term and really fight powerful forces. We're in a situation where inequality now breeds inequality. There's so much money at the top. That $2 billion, there are hedge fund guys who pull in $1.5 billion a year. So we were talking about one and a half hedge fund guys, entire composition. The Goldman Sachs bonus pool is what, $8-10 billion a year? So for Wall Street, this is tiny amounts of money. And as there's more and more money collects at the top, so does power, and so does political power. And people then get the feeling that everything is going to be decided for them. There's no popular influence over public policy, so why bother? And that's you see this low turnout, this disengagement. And Occupy turned that around for a little while because people felt like something was happening and they might have a voice and might contest for power. But we have to think about how to translate that popular spirit of uprising into something longer term.
Zephyr.
Well, one really exciting thing that happened recently is the FCC chairman announced that we are supporting a net neutrality policy in the United States, which is something that the public advocate has been a huge leader on. And there were a lot of people who came out of Occupy who were involved in that. And it was an incredible blending of different kind of tactics. You saw people encamping themselves outside the FCC commissioners' offices so that they were very aware of the presence, that they're not going to go away. Be physical, be bird dogging, be there. You saw an incredible combination of people come together who don't usually organize together, but working with each other. Color of Change played a central role in the leadership in getting net neutrality passed. And then you saw basically 5% of the people who voted in the last election, that number, put in a comment to the FCC. There are 4 million comments to the FCC, which is an unheard of number. So people were not voting, but were making comments to the FCC. So it's this combination, and I actually think you saw a lot of the connections that came out of Occupy building power around net neutrality. Now, next step is stopping the Comcast-Time Warner merger. Yes. Next step is, actually breaking things up. This is just the beginning, But this should not have happened. The FCC chairman was a former lobbyist for the cable industry. This is not something, we did a power map a year ago and we're like, it's impossible, but let's try it. And when I say we, I was just sort of around for the meetings. But I watched something incredible happen there, and that should, I think, give us hope that it's possible.
Mr. Moderator, I think we have an example before us. I think I heard on the radio today, wow, I'm dating myself. No, I have radio in my car, that's right.
Hey,
Okay.
we're listening on WBAI. That's good.
Today or yesterday, that in Ferguson, Missouri, they elected 3 blacks to serve on the city council, which is half of that council. And so, I mean, there is a significant role for power protests, but it has to lead to the real power. As I said earlier, it will get you the attention that you need. It will inform some people that need to be informed. And we can connect that, hopefully, with those in power to make those changes. I'm a protest person. I believe in it. But I understand it has to have more to it after you get their attention. Right. We have to move that to where Ferguson has moved it, to putting people in power that actually represent the people, for other people.
So Brian, certain events spark movements.
Yeah.
And so in Ferguson, what we all witnessed 2 days ago, Mr. Scott in South Carolina, the fact is that it's a majority minority community, but yet the police force is over 80% white, or I think it's even 90%. And what happened here in New York City with Eric Garner, Akai Gurley, and the list goes on. I mean, there's all these efforts now to transform and reform our criminal justice system, to provide sunlight into the criminal justice system, and trying to change how police officers respond to incidents in a non-lethal way. So, I am drunk on hope. I wake up every morning drunk with a hangover on hope. And I know that what Dr. King said, that there's nothing more powerful than the pat, pat, pat of feet marching. And so we must continue to march, we must continue to raise our voices, and we must continue to organize.
So in the spirit of that organization and knowing the news about the turnout and the way that things may be changing in Ferguson, at least representationally, I have some stats here about voters and how they don't trust the government. So in 1964, 29% of voters believed that the government was, quote, run by a few big interests looking out for themselves. Let's fast forward to 2013, and that number was at about 79%. Those numbers are according to the Gallup Foundation. And just looking at this, I internalized that for a second and thought, you know what, the people who I vote for generally have jobs in elected office now. The people I back usually win, but the problems that I still need to see addressed linger. We all waited in line for Obama to vote in 2012, and we're still faced with the same problems. So how do we continue to engage folks to say, well, voting is the answer if the structures remain, but the players just change?
Voting is only one part of it. You need to maintain the popular pressure on the elected officials. Right. They need to know that they won't get reelected if they don't do the right thing. You need that kind of energy. And don't just be satisfied that when you leave the polling booth, your job is done. That's only one small part of the whole process of how to transform the society.
I don't know if we fully understand the depth of the problem. There is nothing that can be done in a month, a year, or 2 years, or some event that's going to all of a sudden make people believe in their government and come out and vote. If you understand what their lives have been, what they've gone through, how they have arrived at this feeling that government is not for them, how are you going to overcome that to get them to vote? Sometimes we'll get behind a personality. We'll get behind President Obama. We'll get behind the Jesse Jackson. We'll get behind the Clinton. There are individuals that we will support. But once that person gets in, everybody go back to their normal way of thinking and living. So we have to look at, in the long range, what do we do to get people to buy into their own government, their own looking out for themselves? How do they participate? Right. Let me offer a few ideas that I can't remember. I'm getting too old to remember shit.
I know.
Right? There are a few elements that I consider important if you're going to restore and sustain a democracy. and you'll be surprised what they are. No, you won't be. There must be an informed and an engaged citizenry. There's no way around it, not in a participating democracy. There has to be an expectation. There has to be an expectation of integrity and an adherence to some moral standards. We expect nothing, and that's what you're getting, nothing. I believe we have to professionalize the elected officials, and I'll get to details on that in a minute. And I think that there needs to be stricter penalties for those who betray the trust and those who violate those laws. Have the floor, let me go forward a little bit.
That was the
Now,
floor? That was
there's more. Now, those were important elements, but how do we move those elements? I think that home, school, church, all must adhere to some kind of higher standard of morality. I mean, you just can't all of a sudden everybody's going to get religion here, right? It has to come from the community. It comes from the home. It comes from the church. It comes from the school. They all have to say, hey, we have to act in a certain way. It has to be a certain sense of morality. Schools, in addition to academic preparedness, they have to encourage independent thinking. You know, we get led to the slaughter because we're not thinking for ourselves. And where are we going to get it? If the schools, rather than preparing for the test, let's teach our kids how to think independently. Schools must acknowledge and encourage personal integrity, and they must teach for them to understand the political system that they live under.
So
what it's all about.
To talk, you're next, Dick, but to give some context to talk about that morality, there's a great quote, and I'm sorry if I'm quote heavy today, but like I told you, I'm recently converted, so I've made lots of notes last night. Thomas Edsel in the New York Times in one of his op-eds wrote that the best politicians are sensitive to the relative importance of moral considerations as they shift from the public arena to the back room, aware that ultimate judgment of what they have done will be based more on what they produce than how they produce it, which boils down to the ends justifying the means. Why would your group have a problem with the roads being paved if someone got their hands greased a little bit if your way is made a little smoother to where you're going?
Well, I mean, people have to have faith in the way in which decisions are made. You know, they may want to see a certain outcome, and people will support a different outcome if they feel like they can be allowed to participate in it. I mean, if we wanted to, if you look at the way voting takes place in this country, there are so many barriers that exist to democratic participation. In New York State, in most states, you can vote on a Tuesday. You know, now if we want to go shopping, we don't have to go to the mall. We don't have to go to the corner store. We can go online and order it. Why can't we go online and vote? Why can't we, here in New York State, mail in our ballot? Why can we not remove the barriers that exist to people's participation in our democracy by making it easier to vote? We wonder why people aren't voting. I mean, if you want to create a system that discourages voting, have it on one day when people are working.
That's right.
You know. And what I'm increasingly concerned about, and I think probably all of us are, is the movement in this country toward voter ID laws.
Right.
To suppress people
right.
from participating in exercising their right to vote. And the courts are beginning to uphold some of these laws, and it's alarming. And you know, if we cannot, we not only have to take the money out of our political system with public campaign financing, we've got to also begin to open up the process of voting in order to make it easier to vote. Otherwise, people are going to be discouraged from voting.
That's right. That's right. So Brian, he's right. We need early voting in the system. We also need to overturn Citizens United in McCutcheon. Period. We also need ethics reform on the state level and on the federal level. And we need disclosure. I don't understand why someone would be opposed to disclosing your clients, particularly if they're doing business with the state of New York. To me, that doesn't make sense. We also need to make the state elected officials a full-time job and pay them appropriately. That's what we need more than anything else.
I want want to sort of connect these different things. I think the different comments are connected in a way, and Tish, if I may,
Sure, I'm Tish.
public advocate.
No, Tish.
Tish's story earlier about what she did this morning is really powerful. And she can do that in part because in New York City we have a public financing system so that she knows that when she runs for office, she just needs broad public support. She doesn't need big money support. Now, if she was running for Congress, she'd be spending 70% of her time sitting in a small room calling up that 0.1% of 1% and asking them for money. And she wouldn't be listening to people who are homeless people, and she wouldn't be listening to people who want to talk about child care, and she wouldn't actually even know what is happening. And that is all legal. This private financing system is all legal. So we don't have penalties for people who take private money in elections. We call that the way we elect people. So I think that actually leads to an erosion of the morality of public servants. Because in some ways, these campaign contributions are the gateway drug to bribes. You get used to calling people up and telling them what they need to hear in order for them to give you $2,000. Then your own internal moral fabric gets used to doing the bidding of that 0.1% of 1%. So maybe when it comes around and it's something a little more illegal, it doesn't seem like it's any different. Why is it different to take something, or to take a job later, totally legal, to take a job as a lobbyist later? So it makes you feel like your daily job is already so corrupted, so what difference does it make? And that's why I believe, along with Public Advocate, and I think most people here, that we can't accept private financing anymore because it corrupts the heart of our elected officials, too.
Ted?
Yeah, and I would
This
just
process has been underway for like 40 years, right? With the liberalization of rules on PACs that started in the 70s. This is a process. It's taken us 40 years to get to this point, right? It's going to take a little while to undo it.
Yeah, and I would just say, too, that as we're headed towards 2016, it's almost even more farcical because it looks like potentially we're setting up for a Bush-Clinton election. So when you talk about engaging with voters and stuff, I think people are so disillusioned with this suffocated system where it's just, you have to have access, which means money, to even run, So I think especially the younger generation is so disillusioned by that whole process that's why you're seeing people in the streets. And hopefully, as you say, that will morph over time into getting entrenched into power and doing things legislatively. But I just think right now, the system is so absolutely corrupt and absolutely wholly owned. I mean, what we saw there really was a graph showing that there is no democracy in America. Like, why do we even use that word anymore? It's not a democracy. Democracy is by and for the people, and the money shows that it's neither by nor for the people. So that's why there's real anger, and I think you'll continue to see people in the streets.
These two political scientists, Gillens and Page, I can't remember their first names, did a study of a whole bunch of legislation over the years and found out that popular preferences had no effect on their final outcome. It was all the preferences of the 1%. So it's like done with rigorous numerical political science has proved that there is no democracy in America.
Well, when I'm running for political office, I found one thing to be true. The more people you have, the less money you need, all right? So I think there's a principle there somewhere. What percentage of the people in this country are registered to vote? Anybody know that number?
It's under 50%.
Very low. Of those that are registered, what percentage come out to vote?
Right.
A third, maybe?
So hearing those numbers, is it a viable strategy to, listening to Ted and then listening to you, Mr. Van, to say, you know what, it's a coronation, it's Bush versus Clinton again, it's really Soros versus Koch, who's going to spend the most money? Is it a viable option to say, you know what, I opt out, I'm not going to vote this time, because to the question, can your voice count?
Well, you can't do that because you have the information. You have to go with what you know. But there are people who do not have the information. It's the battle of the bullet, right? That if we concede that we are not able to find a way to educate our own people to understand what is in their best interest, and if you keep doing the same things the same way all over again and thinking something different is going to occur, we have to think preemptively. We have to think about how do we do things that we haven't done before. But if we do not find a way to move and educate and inform our own people, we will not win this war. We will lose this war. And at some point in time, as Malcolm X prophesies, it's going to become the bullet of the ballot. People will become so without. The poor, there's no way for them to express themselves, to let people know what their needs are. They're not getting a response. So what will they go to? If we can't direct that into the vote, right, into the ballot, where do we direct it? What do we expect will happen in this country?
So a person who's not any fan of reducing the amount of money that corporations can get to put into our elections and our democracy, George Will, I have something great that he said. It's great. The only constitutional way to reduce the amount of money invested in politics is to reduce the role of politics in the distribution of money.
Right.
Well,
He's no fan of big reform, but he's intent on shrinking your government, but this doesn't sound
you're
incomprehensible.
going to ask the people in government to reduce their role.
But this
I'm sorry.
is so powerful because it's a great and terrible quote.
Yeah.
And it sort of, as simply as possible, reflects this ideology that comes out of the Chicago school, the law and economics ideology, that basically says the distribution of goods should not be done through people coming together and deciding what kind of society we want to live in. All distribution of all goods should be done through a market. And I find it, first of all, it's naive. No markets don't have some kind of structure to enable them to work well. In fact, if you don't have structure, the markets get very distorted, and the big banks win even if they aren't providing better services, right? But what it's leading to, it's influenced the Supreme Court. It's leading to this sense of we don't really need government. And you see it in the Tea Party. But you actually see it even among liberals sometimes who want to give up on government. Say, we can just do this ourselves. Yeah. But we have built something extraordinary. As broken as it is, there's an amazing tradition in this country of this idea of people coming together and saying, what should we do? Not what do I want?
Right.
But what should we do? And if we can hold on to that tradition and reject this idea that the market is going to solve all our education problems, the market's going to build the MTA all by itself, the market's going to...
That's a good point. Like the allegation that an elected official has violated the law or done something wrong becomes a big deal, as it should. I would suggest that there's more corruption in Wall Street than there is in the legislative halls, right? But there's no focus there, right? Why? Because of the uniqueness of the role of the elected official. Now, I'm going to say this again, we're like fixing the edges. We're doing a little bit here, a little bit there. We're trying to stop there. If we do not find a way to educate our people, it will not be successful. There's no way around it. You can't avoid it. It's a participatory democracy. If the people are not participating, we cannot find a way to educate and inform and move our own constituency, then we will die by that rule.
So in that sense, who's doing it right? New York City, we sit here, we're very proud and puffed up that you get 6-to-1 money if you're running for a municipal office here. But let's take it to a higher elevation and look down. David Cameron runs the Conservative Party in the UK. He spent $150,000 to get his job. They campaigned for 6 weeks, and they're not on television. What are they doing right that we are getting so wrong when campaigns go on for years and amount to coronations, seemingly? Who's doing it right out there? Who can we point to domestically or abroad that we should say,
Well, New York City is the model. It is the model. I mean, we should do away with runoff elections because in my election we spent, I don't know how much, millions of dollars, and I think $13 million for the Office of Public Advocate, when in reality I won by 1% as a result of the election, but then in the runoff we won successfully. But the bottom line is I truly believe that New York City is the model and we should look to New York City too. I believe, initially I had reservations, but I've examined it across the city of New York. I support participatory budgeting in the city of New York. And I believe that we really need to have participatory budgeting, and we need to expand it. And you mentioned earlier, just like sausage, people need to see how we make sausage, even though it's nasty, ugly, and blech. The reality is the same as with budgeting. We need more transparency in budgeting as opposed to 3 men in a room or behind closed doors or whatever. I think everyone needs to be involved, and they need to play some role in how your tax dollars are spent in the city, the state, and federal government.
So who's doing it right, Dick?
Well, I think in Britain there are restrictions on speech in a way that there aren't necessarily here in the United States. But what I find odd is that there are no restrictions on candidates running for political office in the sense of how long they can run and what they can say. But there are restrictions on the voters in terms of their participation. As Tish mentioned earlier, we should have early voting where people can vote for 10 days leading up to an election. Where if you're not registered to vote, you should be able to show up to a voting booth that day and register to vote. Why do you have to register 30 days in advance in order to be allowed to exercise your constitutional right to vote? And why do you have to be registered in a political party a year before in order to vote in that political party? I mean, there are so many hurdles to our participation, but none to the candidates. I mean, I would favor flipping it. Put restrictions on the candidates as to how long they can run, and put no restrictions on how voters can participate.
Yeah, because you pose the question as what is wrong with the electorate.
Right.
I don't think there's anything wrong with the electorate. I think we put too many barriers in their way, and we don't make it convenient and easier for them to vote. And we need to realize that we're no longer dealing with a 9-to-5 society.
Yeah.
And so what we really need to do is embrace technology, vote on the internet, early voting, make registration easier. These rules are burdensome. And countless number of individuals have said to me that we need to remove the barriers, and that would increase participation
To be
in the
clear,
electorate.
the question was about systems,
Okay.
saying like they seem to be on to something. And I'm always about the systems because, like I said, the people change, but the system remains.
Well, the system of people.
Yeah.
It's people in
Yeah.
positions in office and so forth. And the expectation that I never thought that I would come to the point to realize that people in public office are more concerned about their being reelected and staying in office than they are about the people that they represent, the people of the country. And they're the ones that are going to have to make the change that you want
Right.
in order to support the constituency. The answer cannot come from those in power.
Right.
The answer cannot come there because they wish to stay in power.
Ted?
Right.
I think it's interesting that a word that I don't think has come up yet, unless I haven't heard it, talking about systems, is capitalism. And capitalism is utterly broken and utterly suffocating people at every turn. And as someone who works in the arts, it's almost funny because it's not capitalism. It's crony capitalism. It's a perversion of whatever capitalism is supposed to be in the first place. But as someone who works in the arts, we're not capitalists. We operate almost as socialists in everything that we do. I mean, I did a web series where it was funded through Kickstarter. Friends got involved, right. And that's the way the economy works, not just for artists, but for poor people in general.
Right.
We look out for each other. We take care of one another. So this capitalist kind of system and ideology that we're bombarded with at every turn really is a lie in terms of, I think, how most people live their lives. And it's utterly broken, and I think people are done with it.
It's funny, we teach young children to share and to be cooperative and not to be competitive and not to be aggressive. But at some point, maybe when they hit puberty, they're supposed to get aggressive and competitive. So there's in some way in which we think it's best, a society is best, which we encourage these virtues of sharing and cooperation. But somehow you have to grow out of that to function as a grown-up.
Dick wanted to make a point.
If we can, you're talking about the rules and systems. If we can shorten the campaign season, I think a lot of us would be in favor of that. If we can extend, so like having legislators run every 2 years, maybe extend the term to 4 years so they're not in perpetual re-election mode, as Mr. Van has said. I think there are structural things that we can do that takes the politics out of it a little bit. And allow people to make those decisions on behalf of the people.
I know you have
And let me just say this. in regards to what Councilmember Van said, and Assemblyman Van, he has a lot of titles, is we need to put civics back in school. We need to talk about the Constitution as opposed to high-stakes tests. That's what and competition. We need a full-rounded education. We need the arts. We need physical education. We need debate teams. We need all of that as opposed to this emphasis and focus on high-stakes tests. Teach children about government. Teach children about civic. Teach children about their local elected officials, how they have a responsibility to their community as a citizen of these United States. That's gone. It's gone.
Okay, but if we want to get there, so to answer your question about England, but if we want to get there, as you know, there's a great WNYC interview where Brian Lehrer asked, I think Karen DeWitt, who does Andrew Cuomo think his constituency is, and asking for more testing?
Uh-oh.
That's the right
That's
question.
right, that's
and
right.
it's not that people are in the streets protesting, demanding more testing for their kids. So the root issue, I believe that public education is the infrastructure of democracy.
But it's being
But
increasingly privatized.
But if we want to get there, we also have to be very clear that the reason we are moving away and towards a privatized education system is because of the public financing system, and it is the one thing that we can do. So I believe in limiting how much you can spend on campaigns. I believe in a lot of the reforms they have in England, but our Supreme Court has said you can't do that.
Right.
You can't limit spending on campaigns. You can't do the kinds of limitations you see throughout all of Western Europe. So the few things we can do are our current Supreme Court has not struck down public financing. So if I sound like a broken record around public financing, it's because it's something we can do that can allow for people to support the kind of public education we need.
It's a threat to our democracy as a whole. Not only the privatization of public education, the privatization of our public assets as a whole, from our libraries to our public square, to the crisis in affordable housing, and the fact tonight there's 60,000 homeless sleeping in our shelters, a third of them children, most of those children who look like me. The reality is that we as an electorate have got to raise our voices about these issues, which are a threat to our democracy in this country.
Okay, we as an electorate, we elect the officials who are oftentimes complicit in the privatization of those things. Right. So I want to know from you guys what that looks like. You talked about the pitter-patter of feet being joyous to MLK, and looking at incumbents and the way that they remain in office. The system is set up to favor an incumbent. Every time you show up, you're campaigning essentially, and it's hard to even get into the race, even with the 6-to-1 matching that we give in New York City. So how do we get people to vote against their own interest in order to get a new infusion of people in there who might have our best interest and be in touch with the community more than folks who may have gone to the other side, frankly, with the absolute power corrupting absolutely? What does that look like? What do we do marching from this place, and not marching, but leaving this place tonight? How do we make that happen?
Good question.
Well, I can say my own path is, I think, similar to a lot of people, voting and campaigning for President Obama in 2008, making calls, knocking on doors in Ohio, really excited about the potential for change. Then being disillusioned, realizing the difference between candidate Obama and President Obama, not entirely of his own doing or his own fault. We're talking about a system that's so broken that I just think the office is broken. And I think anyone who gets into that position is going to be hard-pressed to make significant change. But just to take it from the macro to the micro, I got involved with Occupy Wall Street. I got involved with various activism, and as was mentioned before, I got involved again. I became a student again. I became engaged with my own community again. We started Occupy Astoria, Long Island City, and we're currently building a community center and a library in our neighborhood. So I think the antidote to any type of despair, which is in no short supply, is to get involved and to find where you fit in and to do it on the micro level locally.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. because we're looking for this grand thing that we can do to make things different.
Right.
And there is no grand thing. It's almost like guerrilla warfare. You're going to have to start very local and build and grow and develop. And if that's happening all around, then you got a possibility of something happening. But the idea that we can change the mentality of those who are now in office and that somehow we can make them not want to accept the most motivating factor in America, which is money, is a little naive, I think. And I think someone has said education is the key, but how do we have the ability to affect what's happening in the public schools?
Well, what?
We know it's the answer, but so how do we?
The other structural thing is we have, in New York City and state government, we have a very strong executive.
Yes.
And if we want to change the power dynamic and make the legislatures and the city council more people-focused, we got to give the legislatures more power. And part of that is, as Tish mentioned earlier, making the legislature a full-time job in Albany and putting a cap on the outside income that legislators can earn. It's worked in Congress in that you need to increase the salaries to attract a lot of people to run so that they can raise a family on a decent salary. You need to cap outside income so that those who are working for the state are not influenced by the very people that they're raising the money from to run their election campaigns. And so, there are a lot of systemic changes that we can do, but the biggest change is to, get off the sidelines and get involved, whether it's voting, organizing, getting involved.
I don't know, using Congress as an example of where something is working is going to
But in this it is. But actually,
But
on this.
but I take your point. We need to have a little competition, disagreement, just mix it up a little bit. So one thing that I think is cultural, in general, I'm focused on systems. Public financing, antitrust. We have way too strong an executive, which I know running for office because I'd talk to lawmakers and they'd say, I can't talk to you because it might affect my constituents, right? That's a different way. But one of the biggest things that I think is generational and I want to crack and I don't know the answer to is there are so many politically engaged young people who will organize, who will march, who will give up a big money job to do social work, who will work at a nonprofit, and then if you ask them, will you run for office, they say, I'm not going to do that, that's kind of corrupt. So it is like they are taking the biggest weapon we have to take on organized power, which is not going to give up without a demand, and saying, I'm just not going to use that weapon. That's not cool. It's cool to organize. So I think it's really important to get people in to run for office and to use their power. And they may not win, but to start to sort of bring those voices in, bring in the artistry of politics. We have this really anti-poetic current politics where everybody just delivers sound bites. Like really mix it up, who's running and how they're talking, and bring some more life into it.
That's right.
Well,
I can
speaking
understand
of
their
bringing
fear, though,
voices
'cause,
in, Doug, give me 1 second. Okay. We're going to bring some voices in just a moment. We have 2 microphones on either side of the stage here, and we encourage you guys, if you have questions, to make your way to the microphones right now, and we'll be getting to you in just a moment. So we're bringing the town into the town hall, and back to you, Doug.
I think I understand people's reluctance to run for office because they look at this system and see that it's so much larger than any individual, and that you're not going to march through the institution. The institution is going to march through you, and you're just going to end up being either corrupt or broken. And so I think people get very nervous about getting into that game because the odds seem so stacked against them, which is why I think it's really important to keep popular movements outside, the doorways of the elected officials and making them do the right thing to create that kind of pressure rather than looking for the right people to run for office, because that might not really work for very long.
But you need both. I mean,
You do need both,
like,
yeah.
You can't
I
just
will
have
agree
the
you need
movements
both,
without
but,
yeah.
I think if anything,
major
keeping the
step-
popular pressure up is more important.
I think a major step is, see, the entire community, all the community institutions have to be involved in encouraging voter participation.
Yeah.
We leave it to the politicians, to the political clubs. Well, if I'm a local politician and I got a small voter base and I can keep them informed and let them know what I'm doing and so forth, I'll be reelected for life. Because it's a very small voter base. I'm not necessarily motivated to increase it because then I'm risking someone to take my seat. Right. But there has to be, in my judgment, the community has to buy into this system that they live in. Everywhere you go in your community, there should be voter education and encouragement to come out and vote. It has to be a community thing, not a few people out there saying, hey, let's vote.
Back to your point about removing barriers to voting. We're going to open our first question with you, sir. Tell us your name and your neighborhood, please.
Yes, my name is Thomas Lopez Pierre, and I live in Upper Manhattan, and I'm a candidate for city council in 2017, and I spend probably half my week on the phone begging for campaign contributions. My opponent has taken thousands and thousands of dollars from landlords, and when you consider gentrification and displacement, which has been seriously affecting the Black and Latino community, my question for the panel is, when can we get an educated electorate? Oh, but I take no real estate money, and you can't serve two masters. You can't fight for tenants and then fight for landlords. We don't want referees, we want advocates. And so my question is, what is the process? How can we get the electorate to be educated enough where taking a campaign contribution from a child molester is the same thing as taking a campaign contribution from a landlord? So it's just perceived as so dirty that we wouldn't do it if you want to get elected.
Running for city council seat?
Yeah, he's running for city. You've trotted that path, so how do you do that to make the electorate
A
realize?
city council is a small enough political division that you can really run without having an awful lot of money. Because you can walk a city council district. If you spend enough time meeting the people who are out there in the street, who are the registered voters, and convincing them that you are for them, that you are one of them, and you will do the right thing, all right? You can beat big money. You can't beat big money if you're running congressional, statewide, citywide, because you can't engage those people without the money. But in a small assembly district, a city council district, you can work it and you can win that without, I don't care how much big money, but nobody's gonna put a whole lot of money into the council district anyway.
So I have a pair of tennis shoes and I'm motivated. I'm walking around Bed-Stuy. How much money is it gonna take along with my tennis shoes to get me in office, or at least to make a viable run? If you don't need a lot, give us a number of.
Probably the salary that you'd get for that year if you were a councilman or an assemblyman.
So that would be northward of 6
And the assembly,
figures.
the state legislature, they need a raise.
Okay.
I think they're getting like 70-something.
Well, I'm saying, I'm a Bed-Stuy guy. How much is it going to cost for me to make a viable run in Bed-Stuy with my motivation and my
Well, you got
Nikes?
campaign finance. You get 6 times what you raise.
Okay.
So, you can raise
I'm looking for a number though.
$150,000 for city council.
times 6.
Okay.
So that's a lot of money.
And
even
that's
100.
why you get a lot of candidates running for city council, because they need only raise $60,000 and they get a lot of it matched through the city council. through the
So
city
it's
government.
at least a $60,000 buy-in to make you a viable candidate.
And on the state level, even though we don't have campaign financing, part of the problem that I think we don't have campaign financing is, those who still want to raise private money and be influenced by that. But also, the incumbents don't want to give money to their challengers to be able to run effective campaigns against them. So even people who may philosophically support campaign finance reform resist it because
It's their best interest.
it's in their best interest not to face too many competitors.
All right, we're going to move to this side, ma'am. Let us know your question, please.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I really like the town meetings. I would like your opinion from all of you about, instead of telling people that they are victims, teaching them how not to be a victim. Teach them how the white power structure system works. When people come to me and complain about things in their everyday life, they don't have a clue as to how to even change anything in their neighborhood. They see a complexion change, but they don't know how it got to be a complexion change. They need information. They need to learn from you all to stay on the same page about economic discipline. People lost their homes when they built the Barclays Center, yet you can't keep people out of there. I went there just to take a look-see the day before Easter. They were so insulting, Target, that they had people corralled. And I let them know I didn't like it. Were you saying that people of color don't know how to shop and behave in a department store and put back what I was going to buy? Teach people economic discipline. Everybody has a philosophy about what they think will work, but that's one thing that works for everybody, whether they vote or not.
Thank you. Is that back to your putting civics back into the schools might be a good place to start with that?
The young lady who just spoke has been an active force in Fort Greene, standing up on the rights of the disabled. And so another round of applause because she has been, you're welcome. So I remember her because she marched into my city council office and complained about the lack of curb cuts in Fort Greene and Clinton Hill. And she kept coming and coming and coming and coming. And so she knew the importance of advocacy and the importance of agitation. And she knew the pressure points in the political structure. And she's absolutely right. It really goes back to education and informing the electorate.
And I would just add, too, that what's been interesting in recent months and years is I think language is so important. And I think the language of white supremacy is coming more into the mainstream, that people are using that term during the Black Lives Matter movement, especially. Those words were used, so we have to use the right words and we have to connect the right dots. So when we're talking about a system, whether it's white supremacy, patriarchy, the various factors at play, we have to call things what they are. So as far as educating people, I think people are, they listen when they know they're hearing truth, you know? If you're kind of going around the issue or giving them some version of the truth that's maybe funded by some other interest, then they're not going to listen, they're not going to engage. But when we use the right words and we say this is what's at play, I think you stand a better chance of engaging, especially young people.
There's something really exciting has happened recently, I think, even though it was not successful, but is a series of teacher forums around the state where there were between hundreds to thousands of people who came, and the people at the forums would then educate the people in the room who themselves were teachers, but about the history of the testing movement and privatization, where it came from, why it's there, how testing actually works. And then you see extraordinary organizing come out of that. So that's a form of education that I think is actually incredibly powerful, and I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of economic education, about describing the economic structure. So forums that aren't necessarily just rallies, but actually, here's what's actually happening.
Sir.
Hello, my name is Desmond Atkins. I'm from Crown Heights, Brooklyn. And I've got a question and one or two comments. Mr. Henwood?
Keep it tight, Desmond.
I mean, the economic change in downtown Brooklyn was being talked about in the late 60s. When I worked in urban renewal, I was told that was going to happen. As for you, Professor Teachout, you had it exactly right. There's a phrase that someone came up with: cream, cash rules everything around me. And what I've been trying to do for the past 5 years, and I did lobby our governor, was to get an infrastructure bank and a public bank put in New York State, and I'm still working. I personally lobbied several legislators in the House and the Senate, but everybody is sitting there and saying it stops. So anybody here who knows anything about public banking and what it can do to shake up the large banking infrastructure, Public Banking Institute in New York, please reach out to them. But my question to you, this learned panel, is what you can do to increase people's financial awareness about how they're being personally manipulated every day. Because if it begins at the grassroots level, then other people would have taken up this gauntlet earlier. Thank you.
So Ted, you talked about capitalism as one of these big structures, and at every town hall, this has been a thread of people talking about capitalism and its influence and the need for other systems. So what of that question now?
Well, I guess to answer the question about educating people, I go back and forth. I think a lot of people know, and that's part of the frustration. People know a lot of these things already. We're having these discussions for years now, so that's part of the anger and the frustration. It's not so much that we don't know, it's that we do know, and we're outraged and angry. And I think a lot of people know. And again, like getting back to the younger generation, because I'm always focused on the vibrancy and the willingness to put their bodies on the line. I mean, Occupy Wall Street only happened because young people slept in that park and held the space for months. So people, as Zephyr pointed out, people are willing to put their bodies on the line, and they know, they have the information, but I guess, in my opinion, it's not so much a lack of education as it is, what do we do, you know? That's the real frustration. But I think there are answers to that, and they're very diverse and all over the map.
I think it's unfortunate. There's a book that came out last year by a sociologist, I think Jennifer Salvo is her name. She studied about 100 young adults, working class young adults in their late 20s, early 30s. And what was striking about it is that their consciousness has been so formed by having grown up since the 1980s, in which it was all about you're only in it for yourself, you're totally self-reliant, you can't trust institutions, you're only thrown onto your own resources. And I think that consciousness has been deeply embedded into people, you know, under the age of 50 probably now. They don't know any time when the public sector actually offered any promise of doing anything good. You know, when you heard that quote from George Will about reducing the state, I was thinking, well, he's not going to cut the cops, he's not going to cut the army, but he is going to cut public housing and Medicaid, right? So when he talks about cutting the state, he's talking about the things that do good for people, not the things that do bad for people. But you know, people just have no consciousness of a different way of doing things and of how to do things collectively and politically. They're just all so inculcated with this deep individualism. I think this has always been true of the United States, but it's gotten so much worse in recent decades.
I think another answer to your question is, and I think the example is the Bed-Stuy community where I live, we have community institutions. You got Bed-Stuy Restoration, you got Bridge Street Development Corps, you got Pratt Area Community Council and others that are doing financial empowerment. So they're reaching out and they're bringing people in and they're teaching them the things that you said they need to know. So things are happening on a micro level. How it gets blown up, I don't know. But it is happening, and if it's happening, if it begins to happen in every community, you know, that's the movement. But you know, everything is local. It happens in your community, and you go it from there.
All right, ma'am.
I thank you all for this. This is an amazing talk, and it's inspiring me, and I'm an old activist. I'm not a young and fresh. No. I'm a Vietnam generation activist, and I was at Occupy Wall Street. I was at Zuccotti Park. I had a website, Free Zuccotti Park, where I chronicled all of the fencing and the barricades that kept going up like they were breeding and multiplying, the barricades and the fencing, and I also chronicled a lot of the police brutality that was there. And that is, I appreciate your comment, Ted, that it did not fizzle out. It was beaten to death. I was there. I watched the police ripping the tents apart, even when puppies were inside tents with the occupiers. So I won't go there, but I really appreciate your saying it did not fizzle out. And a lot of those Occupy people are still working. I'm still working in other movements. I just wanted to say quickly, this issue of language and talking about how important language is. Affordable housing is a phrase that's really giving me agita. Yep. And that could be my elderly status as well. But I was hopeful, and I am still hopeful, with Bill de Blasio in office and working with Tish here, who I'm a huge fan of all of your work. And I loved you when you were our council person. Thank you. I am evicted from Park Slope, living in Flatbush. I am a good sort of icon of what has happened to the community in Brooklyn, because my landlord went from an $800 a month to $3,400 a month. Ooh. Yeah, and I had no recourse except for welcome to Flatbush. But at any rate, affordable housing is a term that's really upsetting me because it's very misleading. They're talking about fixing it by providing new affordable housing, which is giving money to the already rich developers and warehousing people and ripping them from their community where they have lived, where their grocers are, where their dry cleaners are, where the kids around them are, and forcing them to be warehoused across town at a new, lovely, affordable building. That is not fixing the problem. And I'm really sad that I don't hear about Bill de Blasio, God bless him, he wants to give us money to fight our landlords. You can't fight your landlords if the law's on their side. Right. And what it is the MCI, the major capital improvements, have usurped any rent regulations. There used to be rent regulations, I'm sure you're aware. The MCI, which shows a landlord can spend X amount of money, and once he spends that money, that property is now out of rent regulation. You can't fight a landlord when the law is on their side.
That's right.
So I'm just upset. I'll
We
try to
understand.
walk
Where were
it back.
you during the gentrification town hall?
And
Around here. We
I was probably
understand.
looking for an apartment. But that's it. My
The real
question, I
world
guess, is can we
intercedes.
try to frame this issue of homelessness keeps being talked about like it's an orphan out of context. People are homeless because, like myself, they're living in an apartment and they get a notice that their apartment is now going to be quadrupled in rent. Those people are not homeless because they all of a sudden found themselves lost
Right.
in the streets of New
Right.
York.
Gotcha. Tish, you said it. Oil is to Texas as real estate is to New York.
That sums it up. That sums it up. And you know, she's absolutely right, and I hear your frustration and I feel your frustration. There's a number of issues. One, the state legislature, as you know, removed 421A reforms and rent regulations from the budget. Those issues are up for renewal in the month of June. All of us have to go to Albany and make sure that we reform rent deregulation or luxury decontrol. We have to make sure that we maintain all of the rent regulations. We've got to dramatically reform 421A. There is an argument out there that says we should let 421A go to hell. There's an argument out there. I think that obviously we need some policies with respect to rent regs in Albany because the lobbyists will be in Albany. Trust me. And we've got to make sure that we are vigilant in Albany to ensure that the state assembly, which is our only hope, remains true and they are reminded of why they were elected. And so we've got to go to Albany. Two, the other thing is when you go into housing court, you know, I used to represent tenants. Every tenant, for the most part, goes in there, they're not represented by council. Every landlord is represented by council. There are more housing parts in landlord-tenant court dedicated to landlords and not tenants. And so right now there is a bill pending in the city council to provide tenants lawyers. And we need to get that bill passed. Everyone should call their council member. And so those issues and more are major issues. You're absolutely right. We rezoned a lot of New York City. We keep saying affordable housing. Affordable housing to who?
Exactly.
AMI is a
You wanna
joke.
stay where you
MCIs
live.
are a joke. We can have another forum. Brian, would you have another forum on affordable housing?
Would you come?
I'd like to say something about the mayor's housing program, which needs very careful scrutiny. I think the details are rather thin, but it looks like he's talking about 70 to 80% market rate housing and 20 or 30% affordable. And as Tish suggested, that definition of affordable is very strange. The neighborhood that's being most targeted in his plan is East New York, which was the recipient of the highest number of displaced people during the Bloomberg years. So what it looks like is going to happen in East New York is we're going to get this 70 or 80% market rate housing, and the 20 or 30% that's affordable is going to have an income level that is probably about twice the existing level in East New York now. So the affordable portion is gentrifying, let alone the market portion. Now we need public housing and we need rent regulation, and we need to invest in the public housing we have, which can be very, very good, and we need better rent regulation. And all this stuff about like seducing landlords into providing affordable housing, that's never going to work.
And we need set-asides. In all of the units that we are building for the affordable housing, we need set-asides. Set-asides for people who are formerly homeless. Set-asides for individuals living with AIDS. Set-asides for individuals who are mentally ill. Set-asides for victims of domestic violence. That's what we need. And we need to bring down those income bands for working individuals, the low-income individuals. People are afraid, politicians are afraid to talk about poor people and poverty. I've been talking about poverty for 15 years, and now all of a sudden it's become a catchphrase. The concentration of wealth in this nation and the growing income inequality in this nation is unsustainable. And so all of us have got to raise our voices. We've got to talk about affordable housing. We're working with the administration because it's not only East New York, it's the South Bronx. They've got a wonderful organization in the South Bronx that has demanded of this administration certain principles. It's parts of Queens and other parts in the city of New York. But Brian has promised us a reform on affordable housing, and I promise to be back.
Now wait, before we get to that forum and your question, I'm going to ask you, as we sit here right now, the people who spent the most money on the city council elections this year were the real estate lobby and investors. So how do we get those reforms when the people who are running the reforms have been bought almost into office by the people who are there now supposed to say, hey, wait a minute?
Well, it's even more devious than that. the real estate industry spends a lot of money in upstate races. Basically, so that there's not a constituency for what's happening in New York City in their district, but then they purchase the interests of the upstate races. So that's why we need campaign finance reform throughout the state. So it's not just in the city.
You point out a problem with Citizens United, the horrible Supreme Court decision that allowed, unlimited amounts of money.
There's plenty of problems with it.
To be spent outside of the campaigns and these independent expenditures. It's
Okay,
And
back to
can I
you.
just quickly,
Yeah,
just
take
2
it.
sentences. People are poor. I'm amongst artists. Like, I was with a friend, and I'll just quickly say it. And he was talking about middle class versus poor. And he's like, I had the realization, I'm not middle class, I'm poor. And I think we're all walking around, New Yorkers, with this idea of middle class. We're poor. Most people I know are poor. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're struggling to make ends meet. So, like, we almost, again, with language, we have to demystify and take away the sting of what poverty is, or the face of what poverty is, because poverty is really all around us.
I just want to say the public advocate had another commitment that she had to honor this evening. So we thank her, and she's going to be back in just a second. It's fine. I totally misspoke. She's just going to be back in a second. Sir.
My name is James. I'm from Prospect Heights, Tish's old constituency, actually. And I used to run the communications for a city councilman. I love politics, but I'm really disheartened with the whole system, like you were just talking about with this thing with city councilmen. I have 2 things that I want to give as examples. One is with Elizabeth Warren, and one is with Rand Paul. I watched him on Sean Hannity last night, I'm embarrassed to say, but Sean Hannity basically spoon-fed him answers in response to him siding with President Obama on his foreign policy with Iran. And he danced around this question for literally 10 minutes, and then at the end of it, Sean Hannity said, but you have to say that Iran, you're against Iran eventually getting this nuclear weapon. And he said, and then at the end of it, he had to agree with Sean Hannity. Mm-hmm. He couldn't stand on his own 2 feet and say, this is what I believe in. Elizabeth Warren, on the other hand, who is very outspoken always, and says that they should have broken these banks in 2, she got a lot of flack for it. Right. And, the people on Wall Street who support Democrats actually threatened to take funding from them for her being so bold about it. So how can you have candidates actually stand for what they believe in? I love Hillary Clinton, but I don't think that she's going to go up against these banks.
You just lost them.
I'm sorry?
Said you just lost them.
Well, this is a fact. How are we going to get candidates that actually say what they believe in and actually try to fix this system? We were talking about.
That's the question.
We were talking about changing it altogether. Right. How do we change that system of government? Do we have? And people have told me that before, but again, I'm disheartened with it. I don't want to have to say something in order for someone to.
So, Mr. Van, you have taken that long walk, and now you're on the other side of it. Give us that perspective of someone who's been in the belly of the beast, and now you're on the outside. How do we get people to, remain true and stay the course? I remember reading someone said the good definition of a corrupt politician is someone who gets bought and stays bought.
Well, bought and unbossed. There's some believe that you should just line all of them up and get rid of that class and start a new one. Yep. I don't ascribe to that. That's not my point of view. I think that something was said, and I have to respond to, about President Obama and that how excited we were about his election. Then he got elected, and then as if it was a downer. I want to commend President Obama, not for the only things that he were able to accomplish and get done, but by revealing America to us. Because we thought everything was everything. We did not understand that in America, our congresspersons can say in public that the only objective they have is to make sure that their president does not get his agenda realized. What? Let's understand what that says. Their only objective as our representative in Congress, representing everybody in America, not that little district that they come from, but their primary objective is to make sure that this president does not get anything done. That tells us what we're dealing with in America, all right? And so
this is a two-party system, and it sounds like there's one that's always standing in the way of the other. We're talking about systems. Zephyr, would you think that we're going to evolve past the Dems and the Republicans?
Well, I don't think it's going to be evolution. It's not going to happen all by itself, just getting better. Well, we sort of passively watch it on TV. Yeah. I think the odds are not great. We're in bad shape. But I'll tell you what gives me hope. So my answer to the last person is public financing of elections, and not just at the city level, at the state level, not just at the state level, everywhere, because you need it system-wide, along with some of the other reforms. But here's a reason that I believe it's possible, is when I get sort of low about where we are, I think about how low I would be in 1900. So in 1900, we have fought a civil war, and African Americans do not have economic rights and do not have political rights. The suffragists have been active, and women can't vote. And there's these anti-monopolists who've been running around saying down with monopolies, and the railroads and the banks run everything. So the questioner at the time might have basically said, I feel sort of despairing, should I give up? Well, if the organizers in 1900 had given up, we would have gotten to an oligarchy a lot sooner. But instead, people kept organizing, kept working, kept demanding, kept insisting on principles, and it didn't happen in a direct line, but eventually we achieved some of the best parts of American history. And I still don't think we've reached the best part of American history yet, but it's not going to happen if we retreat.
Yeah, listening to that, we're like post-Garner. We still don't have an equality agenda from Governor Cuomo like he said he would. And there's still a lot of problems from 19 to 2015, but the progress is happening. Sir.
Hi, my name is Matt Fairley. I'm from Carroll Gardens, and I'm involved in local politics as an executive board member of the Kings County Republicans. But just so you know, I don't speak on their behalf tonight. I know we're going out live. I don't want that to be misconstrued. I think it's very interesting that you brought up Prime Minister Cameron, because I don't think what people realize here is that the average member of the UK Parliament has less constituents than the average New York City Council member, 90,000 to 150,000. The average New York City Council member has more constituents than the average New York State Assembly member, 150,000 to 130,000. So we have this remove here, at least in New York City, where the lowest level of politics you can be elected to has such a high number of constituents. Do you think, talking about what Assemblyman and Councilman Vance said, how you don't need money if you have the votes, you have an army, do you think we can take money out of politics if we were to, say, increase the number of elected officials so that more grassroots activists could have a better access to the candidate and could have a better impact on the election? Or do you think we should do something along the lines of maybe finding more elected officials here in New York City by, say, making the local community boards elected positions, or finding other ways to find lower level elected officials so that the elected officials that we do have are closer to the people they represent and don't have to have so many people so that they're required to get $60,000, $70,000 just to walk into the game, which, well, we all say it's, $60,000 compared to the $2 billion spent on being president, but does anyone here in this room have $60,000 in their pocket that they could spend to go run for an office?
So this is a Republican arguing for bigger government.
No. A Republican argument for more government. I would actually say that, having been a budget delegate, I actually could talk a whole lot about the bureaucracy, but we're not going to go into that here.
After 9, yeah, we'll talk in the lobby. But what about that idea?
I was working the math just the other day, actually. I think the House of Commons has 650 members or something like that.
650 members for a
To
population
have
of
an
60 million.
analogous number for the U.S. would need like a Congress of 3,000, which would be rather impractical to work with.
Let's move to another topic.
All right, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Akosua Albritton. I live in Flatbush, and I have a lot of, interest in Prospect Heights. There's a gentleman, I did not catch your name, you're wearing a black jacket, and I have to disagree with you when you say that the people do know. I can tell you, as an educator at the College of New Rochelle, Brooklyn campus, Restoration Plaza. I was there for 15 years. My students did not know. And if it wasn't that I was teaching a course and adding the information that they needed to know about their government and their agencies and how things are done, and just to encourage them to send a postcard to their representative and give them 35 extra credit points for doing that, they wouldn't be where they were. So I have to tell you, there are a lot of people who do not know what to do. And I appreciate, thank you. And I appreciate the, what our Assemblyman, Council Member Al Van he's been teaching us. There are a lot of things he's been teaching, and I think your background is teaching. So I appreciate what you've been doing. I do have a question, but before I go into my question, the other thing I want to say.
We're closing in on 15 minutes, so I'm going to ask everyone to just tighten up a little bit.
All right. So what I want to share with you is that in terms of education, and a very important alternative that we have to look at and use as a resource, are these web series, and to look at the types of shows that are coming out of the African continent. They embed a lot of information, social, health information in their scripting. My question goes back to what Honorable Al Van was speaking about. And I would like him to talk more about what can we do about our public education so that our young people and adults, adult learners, can be more informed, more engaged, and activated to do something.
The short answer is that every community should claim their schools. Every community should claim their schools. The former mayor did a disaster. He destroyed the tradition. He destroyed, generations and generations and generations going to the same school. All that is gone now, thanks to our former mayor. So we got to, the hole is deeper. But every community, it's one thing at a time. At that level, if the community buy and accept their own school and make sure it functions to the level that it should, and that can be done, that's the start. The answer is organize, organize, organize. That's the answer.
Thank you. And like I said, we are really closing in on our time, so I'm going to ask you guys to really get it abbreviated so we can get more voices in the discussion. Ma'am.
Hello, my name is Irina Hawkins. I vote for President Obama. I was part of many campaigns while answering for Ken Thompson, and for one of the politicians, I personally collected 60 votes out of 500 needed. Gotcha. So I believe that President Obama is going to make a difference. But what happened to me and to my husband and to many Brooklynese homeowners, it's unspeakable. It's something it's worse than Nazi Germany, because at least Hitler, he appreciated his own political party. He didn't kill the people. We are targeted. We demanded by Estonian illegal immigrant who is sharing his social security with American women one after another. He came to us and he announced that he connected to Mayor Bloomberg. He is demanding that he wants to have our lot. So we have to give it to him for free as a gift, our lot. I'm telling you about this story, but it's similar stories for many others.
I'm going to have to ask you to actually share your information with me, because this is getting really personal, and we want to
yes, it's not personal.
No, we want to preserve your integrity and as well as get you some action. So I'm going to jump over here and connect after, please.
May I just tell you a couple of words, because it says just 2 words. It says it's civil matter by President Obama through the whole nation. It's a civil matter to assault, to attempt to murder, put you in jail because of your a little property and little money you have. It's a civil matter. What to do?
Thank you. Ma'am, really, can we right to the question?
Patty Hagan from Prospect Heights.
Yay!
And my question is, I am very concerned about more and more of our institutions selling off our public assets to private developers.
Yes.
and bringing in the state to use eminent domain to clear out the people. It happened with Bruce Ratner in my neighborhood. What has been given away was the Vanderbilt rail yards for no money to Bruce Ratner. And now he has brought in Chinese partners who are running the project, 70%. That sounds a little peculiar, and all his tax abatements. Anyway, how do we get ahead of this? The Brooklyn Public Library is trying very hard to sell off two branches, Pacific and the Cadman Plaza, to the developer next door. It's just, and right a block away from here, 15 Lafayette, we just learned had been, for $1, or is being sold off to a big developer to do a luxury condo, not leased, sold. How, and I went to a hearing at city planning to protest against this, and I was told they would give us no answers or explanations. We could just state our problems. So how do we, when these deals are done already, before we get a chance to speak out, how do we head this off? How do we, the public, get any kind of information? And why are they continuing to sell off our public assets? We will never get them back.
Right. So I have an unsatisfying answer to you. One is keep doing what you're doing, but the other is if you just keep doing what you're doing but don't include public financing as part of what you're doing, it's not going to change. So whether it's on this issue, which is a vitally important issue, make that one of your top 3 issues so you are known, and make sure that those politicians who know you know that you are going to be just as demanding about them pushing for public financing on a state level as you are demanding on other issues.
What's frustrating to me as a good government advocate is that when I go talk to elected officials and try and make the connections between the process of government and the outcomes that government produces, is that they never hear from their constituents about reform issues. They never hear about public campaign financing. They don't hear about ethics. They don't hear about all the other issues that would make our, and voting rights. They hear about housing. They hear about education, which are all important issues, but they're all interconnected. And if we don't change the process by which these issues are decided, we're never going to be able to change the outcome of those issues that we care so much about.
So let me just say that Patty Hagan was in the forefront of the Atlantic Yard struggle, and for 10 years, Patty and a wide range of individuals in this audience, we raised issues with respect to this, I'm trying to be good, I'm on camera. This land grab, okay. But that being said, we've got to dramatically change the ULER process. We've got to dramatically change 197A program in the city of New York. We need to give the community more voice in the decision making with respect to the sale of public assets in the city of New York. And the privatization of public assets obviously needs to come under the realm of the public. We need checks and balances, and the checks and balances really need to come from the public. I remember Mayor Bloomberg once saying to me, "Oh, Tish, don't worry, checks and balances come from the media," and I laughed at him. And I said, "How can it come from the media, Mr. Mayor, when you control most of it?" And so the bottom line is that checks and balances should not come from the media, it should come from the public.
So I thank you all for your thoughtful answers, and that means that this may be our very last question. If you can absolutely, I know, you have to keep coming back. It works. It's hashtag be heard, and the thing continues in the ether, but your question.
All right, so I'll make it good. My name is Austin Bryan. I am an elected member of Queens County Committee, which is the entry level of government that one can enter, you all can run. I also ran for district leader in Southeast Queens.
Yay.
And we supported Zephyr Teachout in her courageous
That's right.
run against corruption, as well as Sister James in her run for public advocate. But I believe in systems analysis as well. And we're talking about money here. And I was wondering, there's systems like Ithaca Cash, where there's cooperative currencies. There's a way of redistribution of wealth. They're doing it in Ithaca. They're doing it in our state. I was wondering, what are the possibilities of using systems like those in order to empower the communities here as a micro solution to micro problems, microeconomic solutions to microeconomic problems? Thank you.
Well, I'm personally very skeptical of those local money schemes myself, but the scale is just too small. I mean, it would work for, like the example I like to give, it would work for haircuts, but it wouldn't work for scissors or steel. The scope of a system in which a local money would operate is just too small, I think, to make that much of a difference.
We're going to squeeze one more in. I'm sorry for your addendum.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marlon Peterson, Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy. Really quick question, right? So as we have this conversation here dealing with big money in politics, I get to do work that hovers around youth development, gun violence, and criminal justice system. I'm interested in the panelists sort of articulating in a very explicit way how, when we talk about big money, corruption, and politics, how it affects what happens on street corners.
How it affects what?
How it affects what happens on street corners.
So at the outset of this forum, I talked about the influence of big money on issues that affect your everyday life. So for instance, the issue of criminal justice reform in the state legislature, so that we can provide sunshine, so we can all know what happened behind closed doors with respect to the Eric Garner case. That was taken out of the budget. That's an issue that the state Senate does not want to take a look at. The issues with respect to broken windows, the issue with respect to homelessness, the crisis in affordable housing, pay equity, raising the wage. I can go on and on and on. But there are big money interests who don't want these issues addressed. All that they want is more tax rebates for luxury boats and for yachts. And so I say to you is we need to organize, organize, organize. I'm in the process of organizing Why She Ran, a series all throughout the city of New York, trying to get more women into politics, because in the state legislature, it's shameful the number of women who hold office. In the city council in 2017, we're going to lose 6 women. We need more progressives, more women, and more individuals who will speak truth to power regardless of the circumstance. Everyone said when I spoke out against Atlantic Yards, it was a political suicide. I didn't care. I really didn't care. There are some issues that are bigger than your next re-election, and it proved to work out for me in the long run.
Quickly to you.
My name is Anusha. I'm from New Kings Democrats, also Brooklyn County Committee. Special elections. I haven't heard anyone talk about special elections tonight. There's one on May 5th. There are no primaries. Who gets to run? How can people run? What can we do about them?
Dick, special election?
I mean, the special elections aren't really special elections. I mean, they're appointments by the county committee, by the political leaders. And so the choices are presented fait accompli, and it's not an election. It's a coronation. And so what we would like to see happen is actually, if we're going to have a special election, have a special primary election and open it up to everyone in the Democratic or the Republican parties to try and get their neighbors to vote for them as the candidate. Or, as we do in the city council, a nonpartisan city election. Since they need to be held so quickly, open it up to everybody regardless of party, let them organize themselves, and they work very well for the city council.
Yeah, anyone can run for county committee, which is where those decisions are made.
Yeah, another answer the brother asked the question about how it affects the street corners. If you follow what we're trying to say is that if you support your local elected official and make him or her accountable, you see? So you don't have to go to city hall for your city councilman. He has an office right in the community, or your assemblyman or your state senator. But if they don't hear from you, if they don't feel any pressure, then there's no desire for them to be accountable because of the other forces that they have to deal with, all right? So you can, you may get elected in office and you have the right, have the right heart, have the right interests and everything, but you are bombarded with other interests, including money. So if you don't have your own community that's interacting with you on a regular basis, making sure that you're doing the right thing, then there's a very possibility that you will lose your own elected official because the community have not come around them and say, we demand that you do A, B, and C.
So, I'm sorry, that is instructive, and I think that would be a great place to end. So I'm going to ask the other panelists if you can share your 30 to 40 second pearl of wisdom as we close in 10 seconds, I'm being told.
10 seconds.
Yes.
Pass public financing of elections, break up the banks, and don't give up.
I would encourage everyone to get involved with the Fight for 15 on
Yay.
4/15, April 15th, talking about low-wage workers. We're talking about unions being decimated in America. So this is a fight to get the minimum wage up from the bottom up.
Dick? Yeah, I'm a big believer in our democracy still, in spite of all its flaws. And if we want to try and make our democracy work for all New Yorkers, we've got to change the process by which our political system works. And that means you got to vote, we got to change our campaign finance laws, and you got to get involved.
Doug.
I think I'll close by quoting Fran Piven, the great sociologist and historian of social movements, who says that elites will not grant concessions until they're really scared. And what needs to make them scared is the sense that the system will not go on as it was. You need the sense that things are about to break. And elites have been very unscared for like 30 or 40 years. They need to get scared again.
Let me close by quoting Teddy Roosevelt. Let individuals contribute as they desire, but let us prohibit in effective fashion all corporations from making contributions for any political purpose, directly or indirectly. Let us take back our government.
In 10 seconds, the antidote to big money is an organized and informed citizenry.
So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our broadcast partner, WBAI. Thank you all for being here. The hashtag again is BeHeard. We urge you to continue the conversation in the hallways at home and in the Twitter sphere. Thank you again. And we have prepared this video for you to see on your way out. Thanks for joining us tonight, folks. Yeah. Oh, no, I guess we really killed the time.
I know, we were all like,
it was like 2.